The Scirocco R has always been an interesting choice of hot hatch to me because although it shares a lot in common for obvious reasons with the Golf R, in real life and in games it doesn't tend to get quite as much love, and curiously in Gran Turismo it skipped an entire game despite the racing version still being in GT Sport. This version, the road car, was not. We had it first seen in Gran Turismo 5 as a DLC car, then of course it was in GT6 alongside the, I believe it was GT24 or N24 spec car. I think it was a GT24 racing version, before of course Group 4 was a thing. Then in GT Sport we only had the Group 4 car, and then in GT7 we now have both the road car back again, this one, and of course the Group 4 again. So the Scirocco's had a really interesting journey in Gran Turismo's history, kind of all over the place in terms of being in the game or not being in the game, which racing version is it a fictional one, is it a real one? This one though to me has always fascinated me, not just in the game but in real life as well. I have not featured one in Beards and Cars yet, and I would love to. Of course I personally have a lot of love for the Golf R32. The Golf R compared to the Scirocco has a lot of similarities, but a few core differences, probably most notably the fact that the Golf has the more obvious choice of an all-wheel drive chassis, whereas the Scirocco is a much more conventional front-wheel drive chassis, which is interesting because it almost makes the Scirocco R more of a combination of what you'd expect from an R and a GTI in one platform. And although typically you would probably put it up against something like a Megane RS of the time with a similar kind of coupe hatchback shape, which would make sense, front-wheel drive versus front-wheel drive, it is still interesting to me that Volkswagen chose to make this level of horsepower be a front-wheel drive chassis for the time, because this is a 252 horsepower car, which is pretty beefy, of course 2 litre, turbo aspirated, but curiously one of the key advantages which you would usually have from a front-wheel drive hatchback, especially a hot hatch over pretty much any other kind of front-wheel drive car, is weight. And it's not that much of an advantage here because it's not that light. It weighs 1,410 kilos, and even though that's not breaking the bank, it's probably not as light as you might assume. In fact, that's a good 30 to 50 kilos heavier than something like an Evo 7. So not light at all, really, if you think of it that way. Now, obviously, modern cars get bigger and heavier all the time with safety tech in general, with wiring all over the place and multiple ECUs in many cases. So, of course, they are going to get bigger and heavier. But for a front-wheel drive car in the performance category especially, that isn't all that big, the Scirocco is not an overly large car to still weigh that much. Might be a bit surprising. Now the point level has changed on this one. When I first logged into Gran Turismo 7 way back and noted down all the specs of the cars, this used to be a 506 point vehicle stock. Now it's been readjusted to 502, just under 503, so not a huge difference, but a slight drop, and the pricing is not that great either, at least in a vacuum. 51,000 credits is an unusually high amount for a hatchback, or at least it seems so at first glance. Of course it doesn't really matter within Gran Turismo because you can afford that in the blink of an eye really. So the question is, what is this like to actually use for racing? Because although the Golf R is by far the more obvious choice, and I recently found that there was a Golf R32 featured in Scapes, which was quite fun to see. It was the same generation as the one that I had, the Mark V, which I would personally love to see in Gran Turismo, and it's absolutely insane to me that neither Forza or Gran Turismo have ever featured a Mark V R32, which is insane when you realise that, but they didn't do that. And not only did they not feature a Golf R32, they didn't even feature a Golf R. They've just got the GTI. So a very interesting mishmash of choices when it comes to the Volkswagen dealership, in particular in this game. You've got the addition of the Polo, which is nice to see. You've got the carryover of the Golf, which is an interesting choice. Not a car which I see that many people using. And then you've got this one, which is technically like the highest on the tree out of those three, but still doesn't really feel like it's shooting for the stars in terms of its ability. It's a perfectly fine hot hatch, especially if you compare it to newer stuff. A front-wheel drive chassis and 250 horsepower is all well and good, but that has a distinctly mid to late 2000s kind of feel to it. By the time, the mid-2010s came along, and certainly beyond, you've already got more hatchbacks turning to higher levels of horsepower, well beyond 300 in many cases. Some still had rear-wheel drive or front-wheel drive, but most were at least considering four-wheel drive, probably most notably the Mercedes A-Class with huge power and phenomenal acceleration. And then you've got this kind of straggler from around 2010, which is kind of a carryover from an older time, but in some ways moving towards the new generation. It's kind of a weird car that feels like it slips between the cracks to some degree. I would say that overall, you may be better off going with something like a Megane RS. I personally have more allegiance to Volkswagen, and from my personal ownership, they've been fantastic cars in real life, and I inherently want to like them, but with the Renault, I feel like you might be getting a better all-round deal compared to this car, at least if you're looking specifically for that kind of front-engine, front-wheel drive hot hatch platform. Overall, the Scirocco is not the kind of car that's going to blow your mind. I do, interestingly, find the Group 4 car to be pretty damn great, and in the relatively short amount of time that I spent actually racing in sport mode in GT Sport, for those who did watch that very short series of me ranking up my levels and seeing how far I could go without losing any events, I used Volkswagen as my manufacturer of choice, with of course the Group 3 Beetle and the Group 4 Scirocco, and they are both fantastic, or at least they really were back then. Now, things have been readjusted a little bit, but they're still pretty strong choices. And that's the interesting thing about front-wheel drive. It can be a hindrance, or it can be a fantastic help, because more often than not, you will be allowed to extract more from a front-wheel drive platform for its given point level, because the game almost seems to assume that you're not going to be able to put that power down. And although that's true off the line, when a front-wheel drive car is already moving, it can be an absolute monster. Just look at the Nissan GT-R Nismo with front-wheel drive. That's the nth degree, and even though that's a very challenging car to use effectively for many people, it does show what a front-wheel drive chassis really can do. Honda, they've been doing it for years. Renault have been doing it for years. To me, Volkswagen might have taken a misstep by making this one a GTI-style platform, but with the power of an R. In the game, though, it has a lot to love. I've always thought it was a great-looking car, and if nothing else, it's a bit of a less expected choice. Regardless of how good it is, though, I am happy to see it back. Makes a lot of sense to have it when the racing version's in the game, but I'd love to hear down below. Do you find that this is a car that you don't really use? Do you find it's a car that you do like quite a lot for maybe certain events or certain point levels? Or even just, is it your choice or not choice of front-wheel drive car? Because there are some pretty good ones to go for. But until next time, I'll see you then with more reviews, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.